Hey guys, welcome to Beklaedt's YouTube channel. If you are new to this channel, please hit the subscribe button so you never miss out on new videos, tips and tricks and much more. My name is Iben and throughout 2 videos I'll show you how I sew my blazer inspired dress vest Lyng. This is the second video out of 2, and in this video I'll specifically show you how to make a peak lapel collar, how to gather the lining with the outer fabric, and how to make a double-breasted closure on the front. Remember that you can buy the sewing pattern for Lyng on my website Beklaedt.com. Okay, let's keep going. Find the front facings and the back facing. As you can see, I have already finished sewing the dart by the neckline on the front facings, which I showed you how to do in the first video. Place the back facing on top of the front facings, right sides together, and gather the pieces by the shoulder seams. Stitch the shoulder seams and split open the seam afterwards. Find the upper collar. The upper collar is attached to the facing, so the corner of the collar is matched with the corner on the facing. The way I do this is by placing pins that mark the corner. Firstly, I attach the corner at the center back, right sides together. At the corner on the collar, I place pins 1 cm away from each edge that marks the seam allowance. At the point where the 2 pins cross, I push a 3rd pin through. I do the same thing on the front facing. Then I push the pin from the collar through the crossing point on the facing, whereby I have correctly matched the corner on the collar with the corner on the facing. Now we can place pins along the remaining neckline. Do the same on the other side. When sewing the collar to the facing, it's very important to start and stop the stitching at the exact points we marked with pins. We are going to do the exact same thing one more time to match the next corner on the collar with the next corner on the facing. Start by snipping into the seam allowance at the first corner. By doing so, we can pivot the collar along the horizontal edge. Add pins to the corner to correctly match the corner points with each other, just like I did before. Stitch the pieces together. Again, it's very important to start and stop your seam at the exact points we marked with pins. Bring your pieces to the ironing board. Press the neckline open. I find it easier to press the neckline using a tailor's ham underneath, as the seam is curved. I finish by also pressing the seam from the right side. Find the two undercollars which have been cut on the bias to add elasticity. Place the two undercollars on top of each other, right sides together, and stitch them together by the center back seam. Press the seam open. Find the two front pieces and the gathered back piece. To hold the two layers together on the back piece, I add a safety pin through the outer fabric and lining. After this, place the back piece on top of the front pieces, right sides together, and stitch the pieces together at the shoulder seam. Remember to split open the shoulder seam afterwards. The undercollar is attached to the neckline right sides together in the exact same way as I showed it for the facing, by adding pins that correctly outline the corner points. Stitch the undercollar to the dress. Snip into the corner. Pivot the collar along the horizontal edge and place new pins like I showed you for the upper collar. Again, make sure to correctly match the corner points. Stitch the pieces together. Finish by pressing the seam at the neckline open. Since the neckline is curved, it's necessary to snip into the seam allowance to release stress on the seam allowance. I think it's enough to make small snips just around the shoulder seam, where the tension is highest. Now we need to gather the two collars with each other. Place the front of the dress flat on the table so the right side is facing up. Place the facing on top, right sides together, and gather the two layers by the outer edge of the collar. Afterwards, I place pins along the lapel and down the front facing until I reach the bottom.
Yeah.
Do the same on the other side. By the bottom of the dress, we need to stitch the side of the front facing to the hem piece. Remember to only stitch the bottom of the seam together, which means you should leave the top part of the seam open so we'll be able to attach lining here afterwards. First step is to stitch the lapel on the front dress and front facing together. Stitch all the way down the facing until you reach the bottom. Then stitch the facing to the lower half of the hem piece. Finish by closing the bottom edge on the front facing. Press the seam allowance from the hem piece towards the hem piece. Lastly, stitch the two collars together by the outer edge. Now we need to close the first of two holes on the lapel. I place a pin that gathers the two layers at the exact corner between the collar and lapel. This pin is going to help me get the stitching right. I stitch the layers together and stop right when I reach the pin. Press the seam allowance away from the lapel. Now we need to close the other hole. Again, it helps to add a pin through both layers at the exact point which marks the corner on the lapel.
No.
Stitch the top of the lapel and stop when you reach the pin. Press the seam allowance away from the sewing machine. In order to turn the layers around, we need to cut into the seam allowance between the collar and lapel. Cut through one layer at a time. Trim the corners around the pointy end of the lapel. Also trim away the corners on the collar. Turn the layers around. I usually use a pin to pull the very pointy end of the lapel into place, but be careful and don't use too much force, as you can end up pulling threads. Press the seam allowance from the collar towards the undercollar. From the right side, make an understitch on the undercollar a couple of millimeters from the edge, which catches the seam allowance through the layers. Find the breaking point on the lapel. At this point, snip into the seam allowance. The seam allowance is pressed towards the facing below the breaking point, but towards the front dress above the breaking point. Start stitching at the top of the lapel as far up as you can get on the dress side. Stitch down a couple of millimeters from the edge. When reaching the breaking point, stitch over to the facing side and continue down to the bottom of the dress as far as you can get. Remember to press the seam allowance towards the correct side before and after the breaking point. Bring the dress to the ironing board and press all parts with your iron. Remember to also press the hemline on the side piece 5 cm towards the wrong side. Now we are ready to gather the dress and lining into one. Start by attaching the back lining to the back facing along the curved edge, right sides together. The pleat on the lining should be pressed open and placed exactly at center back. Stitch the pieces together. Find the side piece in lining and the side facing and pin the pieces together, right sides together. It can be very helpful to add pins that mark the edge of the seam allowance, so you'll be able to correctly match the corner points with each other, just like we did for the collars. Stitch the pieces together. Place the side piece in lining on top of the back lining piece, right sides together, and pin the pieces together from top to bottom. Stitch the pieces together and make sure to press the seam allowance from the facings towards the bottom of the dress. Gather the side piece in the outer fabric with the back piece in outer fabric, right sides together, and add pins from top to bottom. Stitch the side pieces and back pieces together and press open the seam allowance. Before closing off the dress with the lining, we need to make a stitch along the seam allowance on the collar, which ensures that the two collars stay together. Place pins, and please remember that the seam allowance from the collars should be open, so one part is under the collars and one part is under the dress. Make a stitch in the seam allowance, which lays about 5 mm from the edge and 5 mm away from the neck seam. Find the two front facings and close off the bust pleat by making the same kind of short stitch which we did to shape the back pleat. Attach the front lining to the front facing, right sides together, and use the notch on the front facing as navigation. Stitch the front lining in place, but remember to leave the bottom 10 cm towards the hemline open. Pin the front lining piece to the side lining piece, right sides together on both sides. Stitch the pieces together from top to bottom. But it's very important that you remember to leave about 20 cm on one of the sides in the middle of the seam. You choose which side should have the hole in the lining. We'll be using this hole in the lining to stitch the last couple of seams. Push your hand through the hole so you can get a hold of the lining and outer fabric by the hemline from the inside. Pull the parts back through the hole in the lining and place pins along the hemline right sides together. Remember to match all side seams with each other. Stitch the lining to the hemline on both sides of the vent. Push the surplus lining into the wedge between the hem piece and front facing, place pins, and stitch the layers together. Here you can see how the finished hemline on the dress looks like. The last bit of demanding work left is closing off the armhole. Push one hand through the hole in the lining so you can get a hold of the two layers by the armhole from the inside. With your other hand, fold the layers around so the right sides are facing each other. With a firm grip, pull the layers back through the hole. We will be closing the armhole off in 2 rounds. Place pins along half the armhole and make sure to match all seams with each other. Stitch half the armhole. pull the layers back into place. Then do the same thing again to be able to close off the remaining bit of the armhole. Make sure that you are happy with the seam. Then snip into the seam allowance along the curved edge. Last step on the armhole is to understitch along the armhole to get a clean finish. Press the seam allowance towards the facing. Pull the layers over the sewing machine so the bed of the sewing machine is in between the lining and outer layer. While the right side is facing up, make a stitch a couple of millimeters from the edge on the facing, which sets the seam allowance in place through the layers. This seam can be quite tricky to do because of all the fabric that piles up. I think it helps to make the understitch in 2 rounds, so you get a chance to reorganize the fabric. Do the same on the other side. Before closing off the gap, I make a couple of stitches by hand that hold the hemline in place. Take hold of the hemline where it crosses a side seam and pull both layers out through the hole in the lining so you can stitch the 2 seam allowances together with a couple of stitches. When this is done, we can close the hole in the lining by folding each raw edge 1 cm towards the wrong side and placing pins. I close off the hole on the sewing machine by making a narrow seam close to the edge, but you can also do it by hand. We are now going to press the dress and shape the lapel collar. I know that a lot of professional tailors mark the contour of the lapel with sewing thread already when preparing the pattern pieces. I don't do this. I think it works just as well to just draw the line onto the dress with tailor's chalk when all the pieces have been joined. I draw the lapel on the front facing. Then I bring the dress to the ironing board and give everything a good press. Remember that it helps a lot to use a tailor's ham under the curved seams, for example along the armhole. I shape the lapel as it was drawn on and give it lots of steam. It's necessary to shape the lapel collar in stages due to the curved seams. Alright, the finish line is approaching. We just need to make the double-breasted closure on the front of the dress. I always let the right side cross over the left side, but it doesn't really matter which way you do it. If you have watched any of my other videos, you know I like to place the buttons on the fabric to visualize how they should be placed. I'll show you how I place my buttons, but you are free to make your own choices based on the measurements of your buttons. Just remember that the center front line is 8 cm inwards on the front dress. Using a ruler, I draw a horizontal line from the breaking point and 16 cm inwards. Then I measure 10 cm down from this line and make a mark. Then I measure 10 cm again and again. Then I draw the center front line, which is 8 cm from the outer edge. Then I make markings that are all 16 cm from the edge to make a vertical line. Finally, I draw 3 more horizontal lines that lay with a vertical distance of 10 cm to each other. We'll be using this grid system to add the buttons symmetrically to the front piece. I draw the same grid on the front left side. We will make 4 big buttonholes on the right front of the dress. I place my button on the first line and place a pin to mark the start of the buttonhole. I want the center of the button to lay 2 cm away from the edge, which is why the buttonhole itself should start 1.5 cm from the edge. Then I place a pin to mark the length of the buttonhole. We also need to mark the placement and length of the buttonhole on the left side. Copy these measurements down the right front. Stitch the buttonholes and carefully cut them open. Because we have the grid system on the left side as well, it's easy enough to place the button correctly. Just place the button on top of the first horizontal line and place the center of the button 2 cm away from the outer edge. The twin button on the front right is sewn on the same way to ensure that the center of this button is also 2 cm away from the outer edge. The remaining buttons are added the same way. Lastly, we only need to attach the white button on the inside of the dress. I find it easier to do if the lining faces up. While the dress lays flat on the table, place the button in its correct position on the front right side. This position will roughly be on top of the big button on the outside. I stitch the button to the dress through all layers, as the stitches will be kept invisible under the big button on the outside. And that was it. If you reached this point, you deserve a massive high five. This project is quite a mouthful, but it's worth it, am I right? If you liked this video, please give it a like. You are also very welcome to share it with your friends. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. You can also follow me on Instagram @Beklaedt Sewing. Thanks for watching.